The Juneau Icefield stretches for more than 1,500 square miles, a vast plateau of ice and snow nestled between the peaks of the Coast Mountains in southeast Alaska. From above, the surface appears uniform, a quiet expanse of white, broken only by jagged crevasses and the occasional outcropping of rock. Light shifts across the ice, casting faint blue shadows in the deeper fissures, while snowdrifts trace the paths of wind across the glaciers. Winter and early spring temperatures hover well below freezing, though the air remains crisp and clear, carrying the distant scent of pine from lower valleys. The silence is pervasive. There are no roads, no settlements, no signs of human life. Even the occasional sound of distant avalanches fades quickly, absorbed by the stillness of the ice. The ice field moves imperceptibly, its glaciers flowing slowly down the mountain slopes. Crevasses open without warning, their depths hidden by fresh snow or thin ice bridges. From the air, these hazards are subtle lines and shadows, revealing themselves only to those trained to read the patterns. In 1963, a small ski-equipped light aircraft would soon pass over this remote landscape. To most observers, the Juneau Icefield is simply a frozen plateau, indifferent and unchanging. For those who traverse it, however, its scale and isolation are absolute. Here, the first day of what began as a routine flight would quietly give way to circumstances no one had anticipated. The icefield, patient and vast, awaited the unexpected. Don Sheldon was one of Alaska's most experienced bush pilots. Born in 1921, he had spent decades navigating the vast and often unforgiving landscapes of the Northern Territory. His reputation rested not on daring stunts but on precision, discipline, and an intimate knowledge of aircraft and terrain. Flying ski-equipped light aircraft, Sheldon had become accustomed to landing on glaciers, frozen lakes, and narrow mountain ledges. He understood the hazards of crevasses, sudden storms, and mechanical failure, and he carried that awareness into every flight. On March 1963, Sheldon's passenger was John R. Jack Green, a private secretary with ties to British royalty, in Alaska to inspect logistics for a planned visit. Green was not trained for the harsh Alaskan environment. His experience in remote travel was largely administrative rather than practical. Yet, he relied entirely on the competence of the pilot and the aircraft's readiness. The aircraft was a small, single-engine Piper Super Cub, modified with skis for snow and ice landings. These planes were light, dependable, and commonly used in the region, but even the most reliable models were subject to sudden mechanical issues in the extreme cold. Maintenance was rigorous, but the conditions of flight demanded constant vigilance. The purpose of this particular journey was routine, a reconnaissance flight across the Juneau Icefield to evaluate landing points and survey conditions for an upcoming official inspection. The weather had been forecast as clear with mild winds. For Sheldon, it was a familiar route. For Green, it was an introduction to the scale and isolation of one of the largest ice fields in North America. Flying over the ice field, the world below was silent and uniform. Peaks rose to the west, their shadows cutting across the glacier, while distant crevasses hinted at the slow, inexorable movement of ice. Visibility was excellent, and the sun, low in the March sky, reflected off the ice, highlighting subtle undulations in the terrain. The aircraft moved steadily, a small dot against the vast white. The pilot monitored the instruments constantly, scanning for shifts in wind, ice formations, or mechanical anomalies. Green observed the landscape below with quiet interest, unaware that the routine flight would soon confront them with the absolute isolation of the ice field. The two men represented contrasting forms of preparation, one of experience and instinct, the other of careful observation and reliance. Together, they began the flight that would soon transition from routine reconnaissance to a test of survival in a remote, frozen expanse. As the aircraft crossed the central expanse of the Juneau Icefield, the subtle hum of the engine began to change. Sheldon noticed a drop in power output, a slight hesitation in the propeller's rotation. In a region where mechanical anomalies could escalate quickly, he understood that every second counted. The plane was light, its single engine, the only source of lift, and the ice field offered no forgiving landing strips. A glance at the gauges confirmed what he feared. The engine was losing function. Sheldon began scanning for suitable terrain, knowing that the flat, open expanses of glacial ice offered some possibilities, but crevasses could hide beneath fresh snow, and uneven snowdrifts could destabilize a landing. He reduced speed and prepared for a controlled descent. The descent was methodical. Sheldon adjusted the aircraft's attitude, keeping the skis parallel to the ice surface, carefully avoiding visible cracks and shadows. The ice below was not uniform. Small ridges and undulations threatened the landing. The plane touched down with a jolt, skis scraping over the hardened snow. Sheldon managed to stop the aircraft without flipping, though the landing had caused minor damage to the fuselage and landing gear. Inside the cabin, Green remained restrained, observing the technique. The engine sputtered, its power absent. Communication with the outside world was limited. The aircraft's radio could only reach certain frequencies, and the isolation of the ice field meant that no immediate assistance could arrive. It became evident that the ice field was no longer a backdrop, but an inescapable environment. The flight, once routine, had ended. The surrounding expanse of snow and ice was vast, unbroken, and uninhabited. Sheldon and Green were alone. The moment marked the transition from observation to survival. The white plateau stretched in every direction, indifferent and unyielding. The aircraft, once a vehicle for exploration, had become a stationary shelter and a base for the days to come. The first tension of isolation had arrived, quiet but absolute. After the emergency landing, Sheldon and Green assessed the aircraft and their immediate surroundings. The fuselage had sustained minor structural damage. The left ski was slightly bent, and the nose skid was scratched. The engine was inoperative, leaving the plane immobile. Fuel levels remained adequate, but without the ability to restart the engine, the aircraft's mobility was irrelevant. They were on a remote plateau, at least 50 miles from the nearest settlement, and no immediate rescue could be expected. Shelter became the first priority. The cabin of the Super Cub, though small, offered protection from wind and snow. Sheldon instructed Green to remove loose items from the cabin, using whatever materials were available: blankets, seat cushions, and personal gear to insulate the interior. He then reinforced gaps and openings with snow blocks, creating a rudimentary windbreak at the entrance. The goal was to maintain body heat and limit exposure, knowing that temperatures could drop to well below -10 degrees Celsius at night. Water was next. The ice field itself was a frozen expanse, but melting ice for drinking water required careful fuel management. Sheldon used a small stove, salvaged from the aircraft's survival kit, melting snow in metal containers. They took care to avoid ingesting snow directly, understanding that it would lower body temperature and deplete energy reserves. Food supplies were minimal. The aircraft carried small rations intended for day flights, canned goods, a few protein bars, and a limited quantity of chocolate. Sheldon rationed the food carefully, calculating daily allocations to avoid exhaustion while maintaining enough calories for survival. He emphasized small, frequent portions rather than consuming large quantities at once. Daily routine became central to their survival. Each morning, Sheldon inspected the aircraft and the surrounding ice for potential hazards: crevasses, unstable snowdrifts, and shifting wind patterns. They marked safe paths for walking and maintained awareness of subtle changes in the glacier's surface. Even minor errors could result in falls or injury. Signaling for help remained a constant, though uncertain, objective. The radio was checked daily. Sheldon attempted to broadcast a location signal at intervals, but reception was limited, and no immediate response came. At times, they improvised visual signals, patterns in the snow, reflective materials from the aircraft, or smoke from small fires when conditions allowed. Weather dictated much of their routine. Storms moved across the ice field, bringing whiteout conditions and high winds. During such periods, Sheldon and Green stayed inside the aircraft, conserving energy and limiting exposure. Snow accumulation was cleared from the cabin entrance when safe, preventing blockage and maintaining access to fresh air. Physical discipline was maintained through strict routines. Sheldon emphasized movement inside the small cabin to prevent stiffness and circulation problems. Green assisted in maintaining the aircraft and preparing small tasks, ensuring that time was structured and mental focus remained intact. They documented supplies, maintained the stove and fuel carefully, and tracked the passage of days. The glacier itself was a constant presence. Crevasses and subtle shifts in the ice reminded them that the environment was dynamic. Sheldon occasionally tested nearby areas for stability, marking safe zones and avoiding overly risky terrain. Each step carried weight, as even a minor fall could have serious consequences. Sleep was managed with caution. The insulated cabin provided some warmth, but layers of clothing and blankets were necessary. They alternated periods of rest and activity, maintaining alertness for both environmental hazards and potential rescue signals. Nights were long, cold, and silent, broken only by wind across the ice or the occasional settling of the glacier beneath them. As days passed, the men adapted to the routine. They adjusted rationing based on energy expenditure, maintained morale through structured work, and remained vigilant against the ever-present dangers of frostbite and hypothermia. Mental strategies became as critical as physical survival. Patience, observation, and methodical planning guided every action. The aircraft, though damaged, served as both shelter and storage. Tools, fuel, and supplies were organized for maximum efficiency. The small stove was monitored constantly, and melted water was carefully measured. Despite the simplicity of the setting, the men established a system that balanced necessity with safety. Weeks passed in this manner. The isolation imposed by the ice field was total, yet within the aircraft, they maintained structure. Each day was a repetition of assessment, maintenance, rationing, and observation. The glacier remained indifferent, vast and unchanging, but the men's discipline allowed them to endure. Storms over the Juneau Icefield were frequent and unpredictable. Wind patterns shifted quickly across the plateau, often producing whiteout conditions that obscured the landscape entirely. Sheldon and Green learned to read the sky for subtle signs of change: clouds thickening, light shifting, the low hum of wind over distant ridges. When storms arrived, they could last for hours or days, limiting movement and preventing any possibility of signaling from the aircraft. The cold intensified during storms. Temperatures dropped further, and the wind increased heat loss through clothing and insulation. Frost formed along the cabin edges and on exposed gear. Sheldon maintained vigilance, checking clothing, blankets, and stove operation to ensure survival through prolonged exposure. Even minor errors, forgotten fuel for the stove or a door left partially open, could have serious consequences. Fatigue became constant. Days blended together under the gray skies. Sleep was interrupted by shifts in temperature or the settling of the snow around the aircraft. Their muscles ached from minimal movement inside the cramped cabin, and the monotony added weight to the psychological strain. Time lost its regularity. Mornings and evenings were often indistinguishable during extended storms. Attempts at rescue were limited by weather. Radio signals were faint or interrupted, and aircraft from distant settlements could not reach the ice field in low visibility. Sheldon calculated the risks of attempting to move across the ice to reach lower terrain, but the hazards of crevasses and unstable snow made travel too dangerous. Remaining in place was the only viable option. Hunger, though controlled through rationing, became more pronounced as physical effort increased with tasks such as melting water, clearing snow, and reinforcing insulation. They adapted to smaller portions, emphasizing high-calorie items first and conserving protein sources for later days. Psychological pressure accumulated. The sense of isolation deepened with each passing day. They were alone on a vast, indifferent landscape, entirely dependent on careful management of resources and vigilance. Conversation became minimal, often limited to essential communication regarding supplies, observations, or procedural adjustments. Yet within this escalation of difficulty, discipline remained central. The men tracked weather patterns, monitored the glacier's subtle changes, and maintained routines that preserved both physical health and mental focus. They remained alert for any signs of potential rescue while enduring the slow, constant pressure of the ice field. The storm persisted. Hours became days, and the silence of the glacier weighed heavily. The men's condition declined gradually, though methodical survival kept them alive. The landscape offered no relief, and the passage of time became a test of endurance as much as a measure of distance from help. After more than 2 weeks on the ice field, a break in the weather allowed for aerial reconnaissance from a nearby Alaskan settlement. Search aircraft, previously grounded by storms, were able to scan the plateau systematically. Sheldon's earlier visual and radio signals, combined with calculated knowledge of the flight path, assisted in narrowing the search area. From above, the damaged aircraft appeared as a small dark object against the uniform white. Pilots reported its location to ground teams, and a plan for extraction was quickly organized. Conditions remained challenging. The ice was uneven, and landing a plane in the immediate vicinity carried risk. Eventually, a ski-equipped aircraft, experienced in glacier landings, touched down near the stranded men. Sheldon and Green prepared to leave, gathering their essential supplies and ensuring the aircraft remained secure. Their physical condition was intact, though fatigue and exposure had left subtle marks: dry skin, minor frostbite on extremities, and the general wear of prolonged confinement in cold. They were alert, though disciplined, in coordinating boarding with the incoming aircraft. The extraction was methodical. No celebration marked the moment. The ice field, indifferent to their presence, remained vast and unchanged. Pilots maintained strict procedural care, avoiding unnecessary risk during takeoff and ascent. Once airborne, the plateau receded beneath them, a silent witness to the endurance and resourcefulness that had carried the men through isolation. Sheldon and Green were returned to a base in southeast Alaska. Medical checks confirmed that, despite the harsh conditions and limited supplies, no severe injuries had occurred. The rescue concluded the immediate crisis. The aircraft remained on the ice field, a temporary shelter, a record of survival rather than a monument to heroism. The Juneau Icefield endures beyond the span of individual human lives. For Sheldon and Green, survival was a matter of measured discipline, resource management, and constant observation. Their experience reinforced the immutable character of the environment: vast, silent, and indifferent. In the years that followed, the incident became a reference point for Alaskan bush pilots and those studying glacier travel. It demonstrated that preparation, experience, and methodical adaptation could sustain life even in complete isolation, but that human effort remained subordinate to the conditions of the ice field. The plateau remains, largely unchanged, carrying its crevasses, ridges, and slow-moving glaciers. The story of survival there is quiet, recorded in logs, reports, and memories rather than monuments. It is a reminder of endurance under constraint and the patience required when nature imposes absolute isolation. The ice field keeps its secrets, preserving the moments of those who traverse it with care and respect. For Sheldon and Green, the experience ended with extraction, but the plateau's vastness and stillness continued, silent and immutable.